Ben, thank you for joining us today. Looking forward to our discussion.
Good to see
What's
you.
on your mind today that what you would like to talk about?
So, Mike, today I thought we would talk about how nonprofits count board votes and the different types of voting systems that nonprofits use to establish when board approval has been reached. And, that makes it sound a little more complicated than it is. This is something we're all used to, majority voting, supermajority, and things like that. And sometimes everybody has their own unique understanding of what these terms mean.
Good, Ben. Ben, something comes to my mind here that a lot of times you and I deal with small nuances of topics, but I think this is a universal topic. I can't think of a nonprofit that doesn't have a board governance structure.
Right.
That means they're voting all the time. So if you could address that, and I think it's a universal topic, and if size of the organization matters or such.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I chose the topic, because this is one of those that applies in some way to, I hesitate to say every single organization, but I can't think of one that doesn't have voting in some form. There are some newer organizations that are pushing the envelope and using different styles of voting. But at the end of the day, every organization needs to make decisions and have a way to clarify how those decisions are reached. So really, regardless of the size, whether it's a brand new organization or a 100-year-old organization, everybody needs to establish how do we know that board has approved this or that.
And a quick side comment, even the smallest organizations, most state requirements, this is why I want to go back to you, have a requirement of having an annual meeting or at least one formal meeting of the board. And they would have some voting, even if it's just on minutes and that they met that year and elect officers.
Right. There's no way around having some level of decision. Some organizations, a lot is dedicated to the executive staff. Some organizations are more board heavy, but at some point during the year, a board is going to have to make a decision on something.
So Ben, again, thinking back to the 3 board meetings I was involved with, 2 as volunteer, 1 as a consultant this week. I think there's a universal misunderstanding about the types of voting, especially on simple majority. And I don't want to overstress the context of today, but we are meeting virtually, which is still, we're getting used to that versus where a lot of these meetings were in person before and such. But if you could go back to sort of the starting with the simple majority, and when that's appropriate.
Yeah. And regardless of whether a board is meeting in person or online or via conference call, the basic concepts are the same. And the simple majority is the starting point. And this is a relatively straightforward term, but there's even some nuances with this concept. So in the context of a nonprofit board meeting, simple majority generally means approval by a majority of directors present at the meeting. So for example, if you've got a board of 7 directors, 5 of them show up to the meeting, you do a vote, you need at least 3 board members approving under a simple majority structure. Now, where the nuance comes in, if you look at the definition online of a simple majority, just generally, it will often say a majority of votes cast, but there's a little bit of nuance there because majority of votes cast is not necessarily the same exact thing as the number of directors present at the meeting. For example, if you've got board members abstaining, I would say they're not casting votes when they abstain. So depending on which language you use, you could have a different result in some circumstances. And this is a big reason why I like to spell out what is meant when you're drafting bylaws. I don't like to rely on terms like simple majority that people can interpret in different ways. And the preferred language, in my opinion, is a majority of directors present at a meeting. So that's how I look at simple majority.
Okay, well, let's go in a natural direction from there. So we start with simple majority. What sits either above it or what's the next other levels? And also what always goes through my mind is one type of voting more important, or so you have to go back to your bylaws, certain things. I think like an organization that goes through a legacy issue, like they're changing their name, or there might be merging or acquiring another entity that might be different than approving minutes.
Right, right. Well, you can have a lower threshold. There's not many lower than simple majority, but there is the concept of plurality voting, which you could in theory have if it's consistent with your state nonprofit corporation law. And plurality voting, this comes into play where you have multiple options that are being voted on. So with a plurality, just the option with the most votes goes forward, even if it doesn't reach majority of the board. You see this a lot in a membership voting context, which is different than board voting and has its own issues. But members are often presented with a number of different options, different directors to vote on if they're electing the board, different proposals to vote on. So that's where you usually see plurality. But more importantly, going up the ladder above simple majority, the next level, I would say, is what we sometimes call an absolute majority. And that is generally defined as a majority of all directors currently serving on the board. So not just the directors who are present at the meeting, but you got to have a majority of the entire board. And that's usually how it's phrased. And going up from there, and I'll talk about the decisions where you often see this, because you mentioned that, and that's important. But going up from absolute majority, then you've got supermajority, which could have a couple different meanings. First of all, supermajority doesn't mean any particular percentage. Often it means 2/3 of the board. Sometimes it means 3/4. So you really need to specify, if you're going to have that higher threshold, what number you actually mean. And second, with supermajority, it could either mean number of directors present at the meeting or number of directors present serving on the board in total. So you've got to specify the percentage and whether it's at the meeting or the entire board. And that's a supermajority. And above that, of course, you've got unanimous, which again could be either all directors at the meeting or all the directors serving on the board. And one side note where unanimous is most relevant is when boards take action in writing through signing a resolution without having a meeting. That means not meeting by phone, by video, or in person. And typically under state law, but not everywhere, when you take action in writing without a meeting, it needs to be unanimous, all the directors serving on the board. So those are the different levels. Now, what decisions call for that higher treatment? That's where it gets really unique to the organization. And I think it says a lot about what the organization considers, extra important. So typical examples, amending the articles of incorporation or the bylaws, that's typically going to require at least an absolute majority. Sometimes that's specified by state law, particularly on amendment of the articles. You could craft it so that certain provisions of the bylaws require a supermajority or an absolute majority, while others don't. You can really parse it and pick out what are the important aspects of the bylaws, like mission language, governance structure. You may want to set a higher bar for changing those things. And kind of the big fundamental transactions that can change an organization's character, like a merger, a big transfer of assets, an acquisition of an organization, or of course, dissolution. You typically see those with higher levels of voting. So any examples that you've seen, Mike, that are called out by organizations you work with? Because this really can vary a lot.
Yes, this is actually, it's almost infinite. What I was going to ask you to clarify, because I had this question myself today, was I think organizations, when it comes to voting, and especially organizations that don't regularly look at their bylaws should take a look. A set of bylaws that was set 10, 15, 20 years ago, a voting structure back then might not make sense today.
Mhm.
And more importantly, does it make sense for the next 10 years going forward? And I think
Right.
because the bylaws here really um, are the leading compliance tool for how you vote,
Mhm.
correct or not?
Yeah, and I think of the many startup, brand new organizations that I work with. I typically start them off with a fairly basic standard set of bylaws because that provides a simple structure to get started with. And you don't know until the organization's been around a while, what are those super important topics where you really want to build a higher level approval into. So that's one thing to look at as the organization's evolving. Do your bylaws still reflect your values, your expectations? And that's where bylaws need to evolve. And let me make one very important point.
Mhm.
One reason why voting tends to get overlooked is because, in my experience in practice, probably the same for you, Mike, almost all board decisions end up being unanimous. And the reason for that is when there are dissenting votes on the board, usually in my experience, boards will stop, work it out, adjust the proposal, and try to get to unanimous approval. So this tends to make us not be thinking about these nuances in language. But the important point here, divided boards do happen sometimes. And it tends to be on very difficult issues. And this is where you most need clear bylaws, because the really difficult, contentious, emotionally charged issues, this is where you need clear rules of the road to guide you. Because if you have ambiguity in that situation, it can be very bad.
Yeah. So Ben, let me make one statement, and then I have a little bit of a tough question for you. So I'm going to let you know about up front.
Okay.
My statement is I disagree a little bit with you. I actually don't like organizations where some votes are like accepting minutes unanimous is okay.
Right.
I like when they're I know it can cause some issues that there is not a vote is held and it's not an unanimous vote, because I think it shows to me outward that an organization discussed and had different points of view. And oftentimes I will say to another volunteer or to myself, if it didn't go the way I wanted it to go, that you influence the discussion in some way. So for example, on a budget, we all vote on a budget. I don't think anybody, because of the depth and breadth of a budget, approves of everything inside a budget. And I've seen this where members say, look, I have an issue and I feel strongly enough about this issue, I can't vote for the budget, but I understand that if the board votes, and of course we will go forward and I'll support the budget, as we should give that lecture to every board. But I don't like the pressure to not have a split,
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Yeah, I hear you. And I think that's an enlightened perspective. And if I see a board where there's like a 5-2 vote, I take that as a positive, like you do, that they're not just rubber stamping everything. There was a real discussion. And I'll add that I've been working with some organizations that have been trying to evolve the governing model, where they have ways for board members to express different levels of approval, on a scale of 1 to 5. I'm like super okay with this. I enthusiastically approve, or I'm okay with this. I'm not going to hold it back. I'm not going to vote against, but I'm so. And you could even explore that. But the reality, I think, in a lot of nonprofits is that a vote against can be taken as kind of an aggressive move. And I don't think that's right necessarily, but with the dynamics of a board, that's how it's often taken. And I think that's what influences people to all vote unanimous or try to get there somehow.
Right.
But I agree with your point of view
and
there.
We can't be like the Supreme Court where we can have a dissenting argument that's put out for the public. We can't do that. But I think it's a badge of honor to put out a 5-2 vote and show that we were engaged. And one last quick question is Do you see boards sometimes, or even in a committee structure where they feel they maybe are voting too often because just they feel like we have to vote on everything we discussed? And I don't think a lot of things we discuss come to a level of voting.
Right. I have some clients like that. For example, they'll do a vote to approve the agenda. They'll do a vote kind of to wrap up each subject of the meeting, either to commend a board member on their work or say, take a vote to go forward, keep exploring that. There are these things that some of my clients vote on that don't technically need a vote. And my personal feeling, unless it's really delaying the meeting, I don't have a problem with it. It's arguably superfluous, but it at least shows to me that it's a client who is taking formality seriously. And I much prefer that to the people that don't hold votes when they're actually supposed to.
Okay. Well, that was an excellent discussion. I think that cleared up some misconceptions, and also you can be strategic in the voting because it helps you to sort of set the agenda and where you're going to queue up things for a vote. Not that something unexpected couldn't come up for a vote.
Yeah. And then being thoughtful about what areas you pick out in your bylaws that call for a higher vote. Because again, I think that signals what are the organization's priorities, what do they consider the super important decisions to be. So that's one of many reasons why it's important to be thoughtful about the bylaws and really think about the nuances of these questions.
And as we said before, I think this is worth repeating. Go back and look at your bylaws. And if the voting structure in your bylaws is from the very beginning, you probably moved on to maybe a different structure might work.
Yeah, agreed. So I think that's a good place to close. Thanks again, Mike, for your work on these videos. Thanks everybody for watching. Go check out the website, check out our mailing list, and click like on the video on YouTube. So see you all next time.